The virgin Apache girl was offered as payment. The rancher refused and protected her. The sun was sinking behind the ridge when Eli Carter rode into Dry Willow Trading Post, dust rising off his horse's hooves like smoke from a tired fire. And the moment he stepped off the saddle, he could feel something was wrong, because the men gathered outside weren't arguing over cattle, tools, or grain. They were standing in a tight circle around a young Apache girl, with her wrists tied loosely in front of her as if someone wanted to pretend it wasn't binding. Her face calm but distant, her hair braided with simple beads, her bare feet covered in dust, and Eli's stomach tightened when he heard the trader, Holt Avery, spit at the ground and say, "You want the timber? This is the payment," like she wasn't a living soul, but a sack of corn. And before Eli could move, the rancher Holt was bargaining with crossed his arms and said, "She'll work off the debt. I don't need money," while the men around them nodded as though this was normal, but the girl didn't flinch or cry or beg. She just stared at the horizon as if she'd already decided she did not belong to anyone here. And Eli, who had come only for harness oil and salt blocks, found his boots moving before his brain caught up because something in the scene struck the same part of him that remembered his sister being pushed around when she was 12. The way grown men sometimes leaned on the powerless. And he stepped between the girl and the rancher and said quietly, "A person isn't payment. Not loud, not angry, just steady enough that every head turned." And Holt Avery's smile thinned as he said, "Nobody asked you, Carter." But Eli didn't back away. He reached gently toward the rope around her wrists and asked the girl, "Who told you you had to stand here?" And she answered in a voice that was soft but clear, "They took my brother. They said they'd return him if I stayed still." And for a moment the whole post fell silent, even the horses shifting their weight with unease, and Eli felt heat climb his spine because this wasn't trade. This was leverage. Cruelty dressed up as business, and before anyone could object, he loosened the rope with careful fingers and stepped slightly in front of her, the way he would stand in front of a frightened colt, not to claim her, not to possess, but to shield. And the rancher barked, "You interfering for fun, or you plan to pay?" To which Eli replied, "I'm not buying a person. I'm stopping a mistake." And Holt Avery grabbed a shotgun, leaning against a crate, and snapped, "Put her back, Carter." But Eli didn't move, didn't raise a hand, didn't show fear. He simply said, "Then you'll have to fire that gun in front of the whole town and explain why you aimed it at a man who wouldn't let you trade a girl for lumber." And something in Holt's eyes faltered, because Eli was known for not bluffing and not bending. And after a long, brittle moment, the weapon lowered. The crowd broke apart, and Eli placed his hat on the girl's head to shield her from the sun as he guided her away from the post, not touching her, only walking beside her, asking, "Where's your brother?" And she whispered, "They took him east." And Eli said, "Then that's where we ride, because no one should ever be offered like a coin." And as the evening turned copper around them, Dry Willow watched the two silhouettes leave, one rancher, one girl, toward trouble that neither of them yet understood. Eli didn't ask her many questions as they left Dry Willow behind, because he could see the girl was holding herself together with the same thin strength a fence rail had after winter storms, upright only because falling wasn't an option. And the trail east was nothing but dry grass, wind-carved rock, and a silence that pressed on the shoulders. Yet she walked beside his horse without complaint, her steps steady, her eyes scanning every ridge as if expecting danger at any moment. So Eli finally said, "You don't have to keep pace with a horse." But she shook her head and murmured, "I walk faster when I do not think." And there was something in her tone that made Eli slow the horse until they moved side by side, dust rising in small, tired clouds. And after a long stretch, he offered her a canteen, not pushing it into her hands, only holding it out until she decided to take it, drinking in small, controlled sips like someone taught survival the hard way. Then she handed it back and whispered, "My name is Atsali. And he nodded and replied, "I'm Eli," though she already knew. Dry Willow had spoken his name in the same breath as Trouble once or twice, and as the rugged land unfolded around them, she finally spoke again, her voice low. "My brother's name is Coma. He is 12 summers. The ranchers said they would keep him until my tribe agreed to leave the ridge." And Eli felt anger rise like heat under his ribs, because this wasn't a dispute over territory or livestock. This was coercion using a child, something he could never abide. And he said softly, "We'll get him," with a confidence he forced into his throat even though he didn't yet know how. And as they continued, shadows from the pines stretched long over the trail. Coyotes cried in the distance, and Atsali finally confessed, "I thought they would hurt me when they took me from the ridge. I told Coma not to fight, but he did." And her breath trembled just once, barely enough for the wind to catch, so Eli guided his horse closer and said, "Your brother fought because he loves you. That's not weakness." And she nodded, but her hands were shaking in the fading light. So Eli stopped near an overhang where the rocks formed a crude shelter, telling her, "We'll rest here." And he set about gathering dry branches without turning it into a gesture of pity, only necessity. And when he lit the fire, he kept it small, steady, unthreatening, and sat a respectful distance away, giving her space, letting the crackling wood create a safety that words couldn't. And after a while she asked, barely audible, "Why did you stop them?" And Eli took a long breath before answering, "Because someone should have." And that simple truth settled between them like a blanket, neither heavy nor light, just grounding. And she wrapped her arms around her knees and whispered, "My people will think I failed." And Eli shook his head and said, "They'll know you endured." And that word, endured, seemed to change the way she looked at the fire, her eyes not softening exactly but anchoring, steadying, as if believing him cost less than doubting herself. And when the night wind picked up and the cold crept over the ground, Eli tugged off his coat and placed it beside her. Not on her, letting her choose to take it or leave it. And after a long hesitation, she pulled it around her shoulders, glancing at him once with something like wary gratitude. And Eli leaned back against a rock, hat pulled low, watching the horizon, already planning how to face whoever had taken her brother, because her people might have lost ground, might have lost choices. But they would not lose another child if he could help it. Not while he still had breath, or a horse to ride, or a fight left in his bones. Dawn came thin and pale, slipping through the pines like it wasn't sure it was welcome. And Eli opened his eyes to find Atsali already awake, the coat folded neatly beside her, her gaze fixed east as if she could will the road to shorten. And when he asked, "Did you sleep at all?" she simply answered, "Enough," though the tightness around her eyes said otherwise, but Eli didn't press. He saddled his horse, handed her a small piece of jerky, and together they continued along the ridge trail, the ground sloping into a valley where the land flattened into wheat-colored openness. And somewhere in that quiet, she asked, "If they took him to their ranch, will there be many men?" And Eli replied, "Enough to feel sure no one will challenge them." And Atsali absorbed that without flinching, because she wasn't a child. She was someone raised on truths that didn't bend for comfort. And as they descended into the valley, Eli noticed hoofprints cutting across the path, fresh, shallow, heading southwest instead of east. And he crouched to feel the disturbed soil, saying, "These weren't here yesterday." And Atsali knelt beside him, touching the edges of the prints, murmuring, "2 horses, 1 rider each, lightweight, 1 child." And Eli blinked in surprise because she read the ground the way he read cattle behavior. And she added, "Coma fights when afraid. He would have run if he saw a chance." And her voice broke slightly at the memory of his stubborn courage. And Eli rose, scanning the horizon until he spotted a thin dust trail far off. Not a ranching party, too small, too unsteady, more like a frightened escape, and he mounted quickly, reaching down a hand for her, not forcing, just offering, and she grasped it, swinging behind him with the practiced ease of someone used to riding without saddle or reins, and they pushed into a steady gallop, the horse's hooves pounding the dry earth, wind tearing through the still morning until the dust trail grew larger, revealing a small figure stumbling through the scrub. And Atsali gasped, "Koma!" Before Eli even saw the boy clearly, a thin silhouette running with a limp, his clothes torn, his breath ragged, and behind him, 2 mounted ranch hands closing in, shouting at him to stop, their fists raised like they were chasing a stray calf instead of a terrified child. And Eli didn't hesitate. He drove the horse forward, cutting across the rider's path, forcing them to yank reins hard to avoid collision, dust flying as Eli shouted, "Enough!" with a force that shook the morning air, and the boy collapsed in the dirt, too exhausted to keep running, and Atsali slid off the horse before it even stopped, dropping to her knees beside him, whispering his name in a torrent of soft Apache words that carried more relief and fear than any tears could. And Koma blinked up at her, whispering hoarsely, "Sister, I ran like you said." And she held him close, trembling, while Eli faced the 2 men who'd nearly trampled the child, saying, "He's coming with us." And the ranch hands sneered, "Kid belongs to the boss until the tribe clears the ridge." But Eli stepped forward, voice low, dangerous, steady as iron, saying, "He belongs to no one." And something in his tone made both men shift uneasily in their saddles, because they knew Eli Carter didn't make empty threats. And when one reached for his rope as if to intimidate, Eli's horse sidestepped, blocking the movement with a snort, and Eli repeated, "Ride home. Tell your boss the boy's not property, and neither is anyone else." And after a tense moment, the ranch hands turned, angry but unwilling to fight a man who'd already shown he wouldn't hesitate. And as they disappeared back toward the ranch, Atsali lifted her brother carefully, and Eli reached down, saying gently, "Let's get him somewhere safe." And for the first time since they met, Atsali nodded not just in agreement, but in trust. Koma slept against Eli's back as they rode toward the ridge, his small hands gripping the rancher's shirt even in unconscious fear, and Atsali walked close beside the horse despite Eli offering a second ride because she wouldn't leave her brother's side, her eyes moving like a hawk's across every bush, every shadow, as though expecting the ranch hands to reappear at any moment. And Eli understood that kind of vigilance, the kind learned young, the kind that didn't switch off just because danger wasn't visible. And when they reached the stone rise that overlooked the river, Atsali said quietly, "My people wait beyond the bend." And Eli nodded, adjusting Koma's position so the boy wouldn't jostle as they descended the slope. And soon the land changed from open scrub to shaded willows and river stones shaped smooth by time. A place that felt calmer than the world they'd left behind, and Eli realized this was why her people fought to protect it, why the ridge wasn't just land, but memory, history, breath. And the moment the first Apache lookout appeared from behind the rocks, bow half raised in reflex, Atsali lifted her hand and said, "He is with us. He saved me." And the lookout's expression softened just enough to wave them through, guiding them toward a cluster of shelters half hidden among trees, smoke rising from a small morning fire. And when Atsali's mother emerged, strong-shouldered, sharp-eyed, carrying worry like a stone, she ran forward, pulling both children into her arms so quickly Koma winced, though he didn't let go, burying his face against her chest. And the mother's gaze snapped to Eli, wary, measuring, as if deciding whether he was threat, miracle, or interruption. And Atsali stepped between them and said, "The ranchers traded me for timber. They grabbed Koma when he fought." And the mother's jaw clenched, her breath turning colder than river water. But before anger could twist her words, Atsali added, "He stopped them, he followed, he found Coma." And the mother studied Eli with the silent gratitude of someone unused to receiving help from those outside the tribe. Then nodded once, a gesture small but heavy, and said in accented English, "You returned what was stolen." And Eli replied simply, "No debt between us," because he didn't want thanks, only justice, only for this boy to never be treated like a bargaining chip again. And as Coma drifted back asleep, the medicine woman approached with herbs and warm cloth. Tending his bruised ankle and cracked lips with gentle precision, while Atsali stood rigid beside Eli as though ready for the next danger despite being home. And Eli finally said quietly, "You can rest now. He's safe." But she shook her head, whispering, "Safe for now, not from them." And Eli knew exactly who she meant. The ranch boss who believed owning land meant owning lives. And he sighed because returning the children to their family wasn't the end. The ranch hands would return to the boss with their version of the story, and retaliation would follow. Maybe fast, maybe slow, but certain. And when the chief arrived, older, steady as the rocks underfoot, carrying authority not in volume but in presence, he listened to Atsali recount everything, then turned to Eli and said, "You intervened in a conflict not yours." And Eli answered, "A child in chains makes it my conflict." And something like respect flickered in the chief's eyes before he said, "Then understand. Now you stand in it with us." And Eli nodded, accepting that truth, knowing the ridge would soon echo with trouble, knowing the ranch boss wouldn't let this insult lie. But he looked at Atsali, who stood tall despite exhaustion, and said, "Then I'll stand where I'm needed." Because justice wasn't a line you walked up to and left. It was something you stayed beside once you chose it. And the ridge, quiet for now, felt like it was holding its breath for what came next. The ridge stayed quiet only until midday, when the wind shifted and carried with it the low, ugly sound of hooves approaching. Too many for a simple search party, too slow for a patrol. The kind of thunder meant to be heard before it was seen. And Eli rose from where he had been helping repair the broken willow fence, his shoulders tightening because he recognized the rhythm, recognized the arrogance of men who believed the land bent under their weight. And Atsali, who had been kneeling beside her brother as he slept, stiffened as if struck by cold water, her eyes narrowing toward the bend in the river where dust began to bloom. And the chief stepped out of the shade, silent, stern, already knowing what approached, while the children were ushered behind the shelters, women pulling them close, hands pressed gently over trembling shoulders. And Eli moved to stand in front of the path without being asked, planting his boots in the dirt as the first riders emerged. Holt Avery in the lead, face red with fury, shotgun across his saddle, 5 ranch hands flanking him, their expressions tight with the kind of confidence that came from assuming they outgunned anyone who would dare oppose them. And Holt didn't slow, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge the tribe at first. He rode right up to Eli, nostrils flaring like an angry bull, and barked, "Move!" as if Eli were nothing more than a rock in the road. But Eli didn't shift an inch, didn't lower his gaze, simply said, "You're not taking the boy." And Holt spat at the ground, fury spilling over as he shouted, "That boy was leverage. Your interference cost me lumber, cost me time, cost me respect." And Eli replied, "You want respect? Stop stealing children," which made Holt's face darken like storm clouds gathering over a dry wheat field. And the ranch hands tensed, hands drifting toward rifles. But before Holt could order anything, the chief stepped forward, each movement measured and deliberate, saying, "Your men trespassed on our land, your trade was dishonor, your threat ends here." And Holt laughed, a hard, unpleasant sound, and sneered, "You think a handful of huts and painted faces scare me? The boy comes with me, or I'll burn this ridge to the river." And behind Eli, Atsali drew in a sharp breath, the memory of being taken still fresh on her skin, and Eli placed a calming hand out, not touching her, but shielding her from the worst of Holt's glare, and said, "You've got one chance to turn around." But Holt, enraged, snapped, "You can't stand against me, Carter. You work the same soil, breathe the same dust. You're one of us." To which Eli answered, steady as stone, "Not today." And Holt's smile vanished like a flame snuffed out by wind, and he jerked his chin at two riders, shouting, "Grab the boy!" But before they could spur forward, a warning whistle cut through the air, and a dozen Apache men stepped from the tree line, bows raised, arrows pointed with lethal promise, the kind of silence that followed so absolute that even Holt's horse shifted uneasily, sensing danger its rider refused to see, and Holt tried to bluster, "You won't fire," but the chief answered calmly, "We fire if you take one step." And when Holt looked back at Eli, searching for hesitation, he found none, only a man who had made peace with whatever consequences came from standing his ground. And Holt cursed under his breath, jerking his reins sharply, turning his horse in a furious circle before barking, "This isn't over." And Eli replied, "Then learn to end it better," watching as the riders retreated in a cloud of dust and anger, and when the ridge exhaled its first breath of true safety, Atsali whispered, "They'll come back." And Eli nodded because she was right, but he looked at her brother, still sleeping among the shadows, and said, "Then we'll be ready, because some fights weren't chosen. They were answered." Night settled heavy over the ridge, the kind of darkness that hid more than it revealed, and Eli sat beside the small fire with Atsali and the chief, while the rest of the tribe slept lightly, their ears tuned to any distant hoofbeats, and Koma lay inside a nearby shelter, drifting between exhaustion and uneasy dreams, unaware of the danger inching closer with each passing hour. And the chief spoke first, his voice low but carrying the gravity of someone who had seen too many cycles of violence, saying, "Holt Avery will not forget the humiliation. He will return with more men." And Eli nodded because the certainty was undeniable, carved into Holt's pride like a scar that wouldn't heal. And Atsali, who hadn't left her brother's side except to sit here, stared into the flames and whispered, "If he brings fire, the ridge will not survive." And Eli could hear the fear beneath her calm, the fear of losing her people, her home, everything she'd fought to protect. And he said, "Then we don't wait for him to choose the ground, we choose it first." Which made the chief study him with an expression that hovered between respect and caution, and after a long moment he replied, "You would stand with us against your own kind." And Eli answered, "Holt Avery isn't my kind," because there was a difference between sharing soil and sharing values. And Atsali turned toward him, surprise flickering in her eyes, though she said nothing, only pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as wind brushed across the ridge, carrying the distant howl of coyotes, a sound that seemed to echo the unease growing in all of them. And the chief leaned forward, drawing lines in the dirt, paths, ridge points, choke areas, explaining how they could block the narrow pass leading to the river, forcing any riders into a bottleneck that would slow them down. But Eli shook his head and said, "That only works if they come from the river. Holt's pride takes the shortest road, even if it's the hardest." And Atsali pointed to the ridge's high ledge overlooking the open valley, saying softly, "If they ride at dawn, we'll see the dust before we see the men." And Eli added, "And that gives us time," forming a rough plan built not on force, but on advantage. Remove their element of surprise, control the high ground, protect the shelters, and keep the children hidden deeper inside the woods where even torches couldn't reach easily. And as they discussed, the chief finally asked, "What of Holt himself?" And Eli paused, his jaw tightening, answering, "He's the kind of man who believes fear is stronger than reason. If he thinks you're afraid of him, he'll burn everything just to prove he can." And Atsali murmured, "Then we cannot show fear." But Eli corrected gently, "No, we show truth, that we won't break." And something in his certainty steadied her shoulders, her breath coming slower, more even, And when Koma cried out in his sleep, Atsali rose instantly, rushing to his side, whispering to calm him as he kicked against the memory of the men who'd chased him. And the chief watched the siblings, then turned to Eli and said, "You are an unusual rancher." To which Eli replied, "Just a man who doesn't like bullies." And the chief nodded once, accepting that as enough, before saying, "At first light, we prepare." And Eli stayed awake long after the fire dimmed, listening to every crack of branch and shift of wind, knowing tomorrow might bring a fight he didn't want but would face anyway, because some lines, once crossed, demanded someone stand firm. And on this ridge, in this moment, he knew that someone was him. Dawn rose slow and red over the valley, the kind of sunrise that felt like it was warning more than warming. And Eli stood at the high ledge with the chief and Atsali beside him, watching as the early sun spilled across the open ground below, revealing a long stretch of pale grass, thin shadows, and the faint curl of dust that hadn't been there moments ago. The kind of dust only horses could make when pushed hard. And Atsali stiffened, clutching the blanket around her shoulders as she whispered, "They're coming!" And Eli didn't flinch, didn't curse, just stepped forward until the wind pressed against his face, scanning the distant horizon until he saw the small, dark shapes beginning to separate from the haze. 5 riders, then 8, then more trailing behind them, not a full war party, but enough to burn a home, take a life, or terrorize a ridge if no one stood in the way. And the chief murmured, "Holt Avery brings pride, not strategy. He expects us to run." And Eli said, "Then we make sure we don't," planting his boots wider as if settling himself into the earth itself. And behind them the tribe stirred awake, women pulling children close, older men taking quiet positions, young boys carrying water skins toward the shelters, everyone moving with a calm that came from generations of surviving men who believed they owned the land. And Koma, still weak but awake now, leaned against the entrance of the shelter, his voice hoarse as he asked his sister, "Are they here for me?" And Atsali crouched, touching his cheek gently as she replied, "They are here because they believe they can take whoever they want." And Eli added, "But not today," giving the boy a nod that seemed to anchor him more than any promise could. And the boy, trembling but trying to be brave, whispered, "Will you stay?" And Eli answered, "As long as it takes," before moving back toward the ledge where the riders were drawing closer, their silhouettes clearer now. Holt in front, tall in the saddle, jaw set like iron, a rifle strapped across his back, his men flanking him with the swagger of those certain they wouldn't be challenged. And as they approached the base of the ridge, Holt raised a hand, halting the group, then cupped both hands around his mouth and shouted, "Send down my property and I'll leave you the ridge," his voice bouncing off stone as if he believed the land itself would deliver obedience. And Atsali sucked in a breath, fury tightening her throat. But Eli stepped forward so he stood visible on the ridge's highest point, answering in a voice steady enough to cut through wind, "You don't own her, Holt." And Holt laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cracked the morning like a whip, replying, "Everything a man can take is his. You of all people should know that." And Eli shook his head once, saying, "Not anymore." And the chief stepped forward beside him, silent but powerful, his presence alone enough to shift the air. And Holt's men shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tribe was not scattering but standing firm. And Holt's smile faltered before he barked, "You think I fear a ridge full of shadows?" But Eli didn't rise to the bait, only replied, "You fear the truth, that you're one man who hides behind others," which sent murmurs through Holt's own riders. And Holt yanked his horse sideways in anger, pointing up the ridge as he snarled, "I'll burn you out if I have to." But before he could continue, a single arrow thudded into the dirt at his horse's feet, not as a threat, but as a line drawn in the sand. And silence fell so thick that even the wind held its breath as the day's real battle, a battle of courage, pride, and truth, finally began. The morning heat rose fast, drawing a wavering shimmer across the valley as Holt Avery leaned forward in his saddle, fury burning hotter than the sun itself. And Eli stayed where he stood at the ridge's edge, boots planted, arms loose at his sides, his stance calm, in a way that made Holt's men shift uneasily because nothing unsettles a bully more than a man who refuses to move. And the chief stepped to Eli's right, while 2 Lakota men flanked his left, their silhouettes sharp against the sky, creating a picture that made it clear this ridge was no longer a place Holt could shout his way through. And Holt spat in the dirt, yelling, "You're protecting a girl who was meant to be traded." But the chief answered first, his voice steady and low, saying, "Only cowards trade women." And Holt jerked his reins hard, his horse sidestepping as he snarled, "You speak of cowardice while hiding on a hill." And Eli replied, before the chief could, "If we were hiding, you wouldn't see us." And Holt's men glanced at one another, because the ridge, with its shelters, shadows, and higher ground, looked far less vulnerable than they had expected, and several riders shifted their grips on their rifles, uncertainty creeping into their bravado. And then Holt shouted, "Bring the girl out and no one gets hurt!" And behind Eli, Atsali stepped forward, eyes fierce, replying, "I am not property." But Eli held out his arm instinctively, stopping her before the emotion in her voice could pull her into danger. And she froze, breathing hard, understanding but not liking the restraint. And Holt's eyes narrowed as he barked, "You let a woman speak for you now?" And Atsali answered with a blade hidden behind calm, "I speak for myself." And the men behind Holt muttered again, thrown off by her strength, and the way Eli didn't silence her, but instead stood with a respect their boss had never learned. And Holt, realizing the situation was slipping, raised his hand as if to signal his men to advance. But Eli stepped forward to the very edge of the ridge, saying loud enough for every rider and every hidden child in the shelters to hear, "You cross this line, Holt, and you walk into your own shame, not our fear." And the chief added, "And you will not leave untouched by truth." And something in their united stance cracked the false confidence Holt carried like armor. And before he could give the command, one of his younger riders, barely 20, called out, "Holt, look at 'em! They ain't running!" And Holt whipped around so fast the boy flinched, but the damage was done. Hesitation spread like a slow-moving fire through the group, weakening the threat by the second. And Eli watched it, waited for it, then spoke again, quieter but somehow stronger. "You don't want to fight, Holt. You want obedience, and you won't get that here." And the chief lifted his staff just enough to be seen, not raised in threat, but in truth. And Holt's jaw tightened so hard a vein pulsed along his temple. Then he snapped, "Last chance." But his words lacked weight now. They hung in the air like smoke instead of steel. And Eli didn't answer right away, letting the silence do the work, letting Holt feel the weight of being one man facing unity instead of fear. And when Eli finally spoke, it was just 4 words. "Then turn around, Holt." And the wind caught those words, carried them down the valley like a verdict, leaving Holt with only 2 choices: start a war he couldn't win, or accept that this ridge, these people, and that girl were beyond his reach forever. For a long moment after Eli's words drifted down the ridge, nothing moved except the restless ears of Holt's horse, the animal picking up tensions its rider pretended not to feel. And Eli stayed exactly where he was, spine straight, breath steady, watching how the morning light hit Holt's face, revealing the cracks running beneath the man's anger. Cracks made of pride, fear, and the sudden realization that he was not standing against a frightened ridge of scattered families, but a united people unwilling to bow. And when Holt finally found his voice again, it came out hoarse, almost thin, as he shouted, "You think this is finished?" But even his own men didn't answer, their eyes shifting between him and the line of figures on the ridge, and one rider in the back, an older man with gray dust in his beard, muttered just loud enough for others to hear, "He's picking a fight he can't win." And that small ripple of doubt traveled through the group like wind through tall grass, bending their confidence until their formation loosened. And after another tensed pause, a second rider, one of Holt's cousins, called out, "Holt, this ain't the place, not today." And Holt spun toward him with a glare sharp enough to cut, but the cousin didn't drop his gaze, only added, "They're standing for family. That's a fight we shouldn't be on the wrong side of." And Eli watched as more riders shifted in their saddles, the kind of shifting that meant they were no longer riding as a pack, but as individuals thinking for themselves. And Holt sensed it too, because his jaw clenched and his posture stiffened like a cornered wolf deciding whether to bite or run. And then he barked, "You'd abandon your own kind for them?" But the gray-bearded man replied, "A man's kind is who he chooses to be." And that simple truth hit Holt harder than any arrow could, freezing him for a heartbeat, giving Eli just enough space to step forward again, voice steady as he said, "No one here wants blood, Holt, but you brought the threat of it yourself. You can leave with your pride intact, or you can force a shame on every man behind you." And the chief, standing tall at Eli's side, lifted his chin and added, "We will not start war, but we will not surrender innocence." And Atsali, who had stood back in the shadows until now, stepped into the sun, her posture straight, her dark hair braided tight against her spine, her presence calm but fierce as she spoke down the ridge. "You wanted me as payment. I want you to see the truth. I am not afraid of you." And her words, not shouted but carried clearly on the wind, cut Holt in a way he didn't expect, and he looked at her, really looked, seeing no trembling girl but a woman who had survived more than he could ever break. And in that moment something in him recoiled, some part of his arrogance rattled loose, and the younger rider who'd questioned him earlier finally said, "Let it go, Holt, this ain't worth it." And Holt's horse sidestepped as if agreeing, and Holt pulled the reins tight, anger fighting with reason inside him until, at last, something in his shoulders dropped, not in surrender but in a bitter, choking acceptance that today he was outmatched, not by force but by conviction. And without another word he yanked his horse around, kicking it hard, riding away across the valley. Not in triumph, but in a silence heavy enough to quiet even the birds. And one by one his men followed, the sound of hooves fading into mourning until the only thing left on the horizon was settling dust and the slow exhale of a ridge that had refused to fall. When the last echo of hooves faded across the valley, the ridge seemed to breathe again, a long exhale from land and people alike, and Eli didn't move for several seconds, letting the silence settle so the truth of what had just happened could take root, the kind of truth that didn't come from winning a fight, but from refusing one. And behind him, the tribe slowly emerged from the shelters. Children first, their small footsteps pattering over the dry earth before they ran to the edges of the ridge to see the dust trail shrinking in the distance, and Koma, still pale but stubborn, leaned heavily on his sister as he stepped out, whispering, "They're gone." And Atsali nodded, though her hand trembled with the weight of everything she'd held together, and Eli turned toward her, offering a quiet, steady, grounding look that made her inhale slowly, her chest rising with something that felt like the beginning of safety at last. And the chief approached them both, his steps unhurried, his expression softening in a way that carried both gratitude and acknowledgement, and he said to Eli, "No man stands with another people unless he knows their struggle. Today you honored that." And Eli replied, "I only did what any decent man should." But the chief shook his head slightly and answered, "Decent men are many. Brave ones are rare." Which made Eli look away for a second, uncomfortable with praise, though Atsali watched him like someone seeing a new shape of hope forming in the world. And she asked, "What happens now?" Her voice careful, as if afraid the answer might hurt. and Eli glanced across the ridge. Seeing the damage Holt's pursuit had caused, the broken branches, the trampled grass, the fragile shelters bent by wind and fear, and he said, "Now we rebuild," then added more quietly, "and we decide what you want for yourselves without anyone else speaking over you." And the chief nodded in agreement, already calling to 2 young men to begin reinforcing the shelters before nightfall, while others fetched water, tools, and herbs for the injured. And in the middle of this sudden, purposeful motion, Atsali knelt beside Koma, adjusting his blanket and brushing his hair back from his forehead in a gesture so tender Eli had to look away for a moment. Not because it embarrassed him, but because it reminded him why he'd stepped between Holt and this ridge in the first place. Some people deserved gentleness after a lifetime of everything else. And when Koma looked up at him and whispered, "Are you leaving now?" Eli shook his head and said, "Not yet," then crouched down so the boy could see the truth in his eyes, as he added, "Not until you both can stand on your own without fear." And the boy nodded with a seriousness far beyond his age, settling back against his sister, as if the world might finally give him room to rest. And the chief's wife approached with 2 bowls of broth, handing one to Atsali and pressing the other into Eli's hands, saying simply, "Eat. The land is quiet for now." And they did, standing shoulder to shoulder as the sun climbed higher, bathing the ridge in warm light that softened every hard edge, every bruise, every memory of the morning's confrontation. And when Atsali finally spoke again, it was in a low voice, meant only for Eli, as she said, "You didn't owe us anything, yet you stayed." And Eli took a slow breath, then replied, "Sometimes a man finds a place where his conscience fits better than anywhere else." And she looked at him with eyes that carried gratitude, strength, and something unspoken but growing. And though he didn't reach for her, and she didn't reach for him, the quiet space between them felt like the first step toward a future neither of them had expected, but both somehow knew had begun today, in the dust of a ridge that refused to bow, and in the courage of those who finally learned they didn't have to run anymore. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did, or walked on? Tell us in the comments.